It's a great honor to be here. It's really, I've got many old friends at IDS, and it is an institution that has inspired much of my work over the years, and I was delighted to become acquainted with Andy and Ian and their project on uncertainty, which is very close to my own interests, so it's really a pleasure to be here. I would like to talk about the book that Ian very generously introduced. What I'd like to do in talking about the book, which I think is, as Ian mentioned, very much connects with the theme of the STEP Center, the embrace of uncertainty this year, and I'll come back to the topic of uncertainty on several occasions in my remarks. But what I'd first like to do is talk a little bit about how I came to write this book. And I know sometimes that's something that students in particular are interested in knowing where these kinds of projects come from. So, short version of the origin story. Early in the global crisis, around 2010, I started taking note of what appeared to be haphazard and inchoate changes in aspects of global financial governance, and more specifically in the institutions, norms, and practices that bore on policy space for development. And as Exhibit A of the things that got my attention, it seemed that just a few years into the global crisis, there were changes around policies that are known as capital controls. Capital controls had fallen out of favor during the long neoliberal era, and I took note of some changes around capital controls in these first few years of the crisis. As Exhibit B, I began to observe the emergence of what appeared to be changes and inconsistencies inside the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and in the IMF's relationship with some of its former clients. And so what I began to argue early in the crisis is that we should be paying attention to these inconsistent changes. And I began to speculate that we were entering a new period, indeed a new kind of period, an interregnum, if you will, that was marked by incoherence and aperture in aspects of global financial governance. And what was really memorable, and I think ultimately useful for me about my experiences in presenting and publishing papers on these issues early in the global crisis, was the reception that greeted my new ideas. And just to put it plainly, absolutely everyone hated what I was saying and told me that I was wrong. And I remember very well a conference in southern India that was attended by many old friends of mine, a kind of network of heterodox development economists. And at that conference, speaker after speaker, including some students who are usually overly respectful from professors that are visiting from abroad, sort of stood up one by one to criticize my remarks and to argue that I was naive and even delusional, to think that there could be any meaningful change underway in the global financial system. And so that hostile reaction to my early work, I think, proved ultimately to be beneficial once I dusted off my ego. And more importantly, I think these experiences in presenting these ideas early in the crisis, coupled with the unfolding of the crisis over the next 7 years, convinced me of the need to clarify, sharpen, and develop my central arguments, and most importantly, to think through the essential matter of how to understand institutional, policy, and ideational change. And so that became my challenge. And the long crisis also gave me ample opportunity to expand my gaze across the landscape of global financial governance, and some work that I did with the United Nations Development Program, with UNCTAD, and the now defunct Union of South American Nations, some meetings that I had with colleagues at the IMF and the World Bank, and institutions that were based in the Global South and the Global East, gave me ample opportunity to really ground my arguments empirically, and all of that ultimately came together in the book that I'm discussing today. In the interest of time and in the interest of keeping you interested, what I'd like to do is sketch out a kind of bird's eye view of the central arguments and the analytical framing of the book, rather than providing a very deeply granular presentation of the empirical evidence across the case study chapters in the book, though I'll highlight some of that empirical evidence in a kind of general way later on. And let me just begin by stating the obvious point, and that is that the East Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s and the recent global crisis focused attention on the failings of the global financial architecture. Now, not surprisingly, the recognition of the failings of the global financial architecture catalyzed development of ambitious proposals for architectural reform. The Japanese government's proposal to create an Asian monetary fund as the East Asian crisis was unfolding in 1997 is one example of the way in which a crisis induced a proposal for dramatic architectural transformation. And I'll just note that a similar story of calls for a new global financial architecture meeting reality could be told about the new international economic order movement of the 1970s, the developing country debt crisis of the 1980s, and the Mexican financial crisis of the mid-1990s. And so the failure of the reform proposals after each one of these financial crises, I think, has led many social scientists and other observers to emphasize continuity in global financial governance. And in the book, I call this the continuity thesis. And what I mean by the continuity thesis refers to the widely held claim that the opportunity for meaningful reform created by the global crisis has been lost, and that nothing of significance has changed, especially as concerns developing countries. Now, I argue in the book that the continuity thesis misses the point. And what I try to show in the book is that the Asian, and especially the global crisis, catalyzed disparate, disconnected innovations across several dimensions of global financial governance. And I argue further that these discontinuities matter deeply for developing countries. But just to be clear, so that I'm not misunderstood, what I am not saying is that the global crisis has occasioned an abrupt shift from one regime of global financial governance to another. It surely hasn't done so. Indeed, what I try to show in the book is that continuities in some domains of financial governance are as salient today as are discontinuities in financial governance. But I also argue, and this is really the key point for me, that a chief problem with the way that social scientists tend to understand change is as a kind of simple binary in which systemic regime displacement is the only and the true test of change. The Bretton Woods and the neoliberal revolutions are really the paradigmatic examples of regime displacement. And I think at the other end of this binary thinking is the view that anything less than sharp and unambiguous discontinuity should be dismissed because it's merely trivial, localized, ameliorative, or fleeting in nature. My chief goal in the book is to move beyond this kind of simplistic notion of change and to defend what I call the productive incoherence thesis. And my argument is that the changes that we confront today are best understood as ad hoc, fragmented, and evolutionary. And it's in this sense that global financial governance, taken as a whole, in my view, is best understood today as being incoherent. A kind of unruly muscular pragmatism has broken out in institutional design, governance, and policymaking. And this new pragmatic spirit entails learning from experience, learning from others, both successes and failures, and adjusting as necessary and in response to new challenges and new opportunities. And so the result so far is the emergence of an increasingly dense and what I call a pluripolar set of fledgling institutions of financial governance and a diversity of institutional and policy practices that don't cohere around a grand vision. And so pluripolarity, as I use the term, refers to increasing diversity, heterogeneity, and inconsistency within the landscape of global financial governance. Now, I advance 3 principal claims in the book. The first claim is a positive claim in that it describes what I see when I look out at the financial landscape. The positive claim is that the Asian crisis, and especially the global crisis, occasioned meaningful, though disconnected, ad hoc, partial, messy, and experimental discontinuities in several dimensions of global financial governance that are of particular salience to developing countries. However, the empirical story that I advance is, again, not one of wall-to-wall change. I show, again, that there are non-trivial continuities in several dimensions of financial governance. The second claim that I advance is normative in scope. It addresses the question of whether what I observe should be celebrated or lamented. My controversial normative claim is that emergent incoherence is on balance productive rather than debilitating of development. In the absence of an overarching, coherent model of financial governance, developing countries today are experiencing expansion in the room to experiment with institutions, policies, and ideas. Emergent productive redundancy and networks of cooperation also increase resilience in the global financial system. And just to anticipate something that I'll come back to toward the end of my remarks, I want to be clear at this point that though I'm encouraged on balance by emergent incoherence in global financial governance, this doesn't imply that incoherence is without inherent risk, and I'll come back to those risks later on. The third claim that I advance in the book is that emergent productive incoherence can be best understood within what I call a Hirschmanian mindset, by which I mean an understanding of social and institutional change informed by Albert Hirschman's seminal ideas. Now, Hirschman's work, as Ian noted, is not very widely read these days, which I think is unfortunate. His work is deeply radical. It challenges us to think differently about social and institutional change. It challenges us to think differently about grand programs of social engineering. It challenges us to think differently about the role, power, and rhetoric of economic experts. And it also challenges us to think about the limits to knowledge. And so the alternative vision of change that I advance in the book, and which reflects key commitments that really mark Albert Hirschman's work, recognizes that meaningful change can and should come about through the proliferation of partial, limited, and pragmatic responses to challenges and opportunities, and as a consequence of what are often disconnected, experimental, and inconsistent adjustments in institutions and practices. This vision really turns our attention away from epical ruptures of the sort that in fact occur infrequently in historical terms, but tend to receive disproportionate attention by scholars. And instead, a Hirschmanian approach turns our attention toward more prevalent but prosaic, small-scale and evolutionary change as the wellspring of what can be meaningful transformation. And so in the Hirschmanian view, development is to be recognized as a series of transformations, each of which amounts to a social experiment that permits learning by doing and learning from others. Central to this conception of development as a process of social learning is Hirschman's emphasis on experimentation, particularly processes of parallel experimentation. Critically important as well is the importance of problem solving in response to previously unforeseen or underestimated challenges. This was Hirschman's famous conception of what he called the hiding hand, which was an obvious play on Adam Smith's hidden hand concept. Central to Albert Hirschman's idea of the hiding hand was his view that uncertainty, ignorance, and even error can be the drivers of productive action by policy entrepreneurs who develop pragmatic responses to evolving challenges.
and just think for a moment about the kind of policy groping going on underway across the globe in response to President Trump. There's no standard playbook to someone like Trump. Each country is grasping for viable responses. Central to Hirschman's understanding of development as a process of social learning and experimentation is his view and his rejection of the tendency that often leads social scientists to prejudge the outcome of interventions so that they can declare ex ante that some development represents a fundamental or a superficial change. And an example of this kind of tendency to parse whether something represents a fundamental or a superficial change is really exemplified by the epistemic certainty that has led some observers to declare that the BRICS group is a game changer, while others with a similar kind of epistemic certainty dismiss the group, and especially China, as little more than sub-imperialists. I'll also note that in Hirschman's view, even experimental failures can leave in their wake vital linkages, side effects, networks, and knowledge that can be available for and that can enable subsequent endeavors. And I think this view is also relevant to thinking about the possible legacies of the BRICS. Other aspects of Hirschman's work that are really pregnant with insights from my own work include his commitment to what he termed possibilism and what he called his bias for hope in one of his most important books. Hirschman's possibilism entails the idea that small-scale, messy, disparate innovations reveal what could be. And Hirschman counterposed this idea of possibilism with what he called the predominant feudalism in the social sciences, especially in development economics. Feudalism referred to the view that initiatives that are not consistent with grand theories and grand programs of social engineering are bound to fail. Central to Hirschman's idea of possibilism is his humility and his epistemic commitment to fundamental uncertainty, to come to a theme of the STEPS program this year. And Hirschman's embrace of fundamental uncertainty connects him quite directly with Keynes, with Frank Knight, with GLS Shackle. And related to his epistemic commitment to uncertainty is Hirschman's recognition with Hayek and with Popper of the limit to intelligibility in a complex world. Now, Hirschman's work on exit, voice, and loyalty is perhaps his best known. These concepts refer to the circumstances under which actors engage or disengage with institutions that don't serve their needs. And I think this framework is useful in thinking about the threats made by some developing countries to exit the Bretton Woods institutions, some of which have culminated in the creation of parallel structures. And in the spirit of messiness, I note that the development of parallel structures is also playing out against simultaneous efforts to use voice to press the Bretton Woods institutions from within to change. And so hopefully by now I've sketched out the kind of intellectual scaffolding for my book. In the book, after I discuss the most salient aspect of Hirschman's work for my own work, I explore the contradictory effects of the East Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, and I argue that the East Asian financial crisis laid the groundwork for some of the uneven evolutionary changes that are pushed forward by the global financial crisis and the aftermath of the global crisis. And in the book's 4 case study chapters, I examine areas of financial governance across which we find continuities, discontinuities, and in some cases what we term ambiguities. And I'd like to highlight now some of the empirical claims that I make across 3 of the 4 empirical chapters of the book. One of the empirical cases that I explore in great depth is that of the IMF. The global crisis has had really complex, uneven effects on the IMF. There's a great deal of evidence on the side of continuity when it comes to looking at the IMF. For instance, the global crisis restored the IMF's coffers. It restored its central role in crisis management. The IMF's assistance packages to countries in distress followed a well-rehearsed counter-cyclical script. Developing countries, of course, secured only the most modest voting share increases at the IMF, and the US and Europe exercised disproportionate influence at the institutions, for example, by sustaining the post-war gentleman's agreement on the leadership selection practices of the Bretton Woods institutions, by the decision to grant systemic risk exemptions to European countries, and the US Congress was, of course, able to stall extremely modest voting share realignments for a 5-year period. And I'll note that President Trump's team at the US Treasury and the acting but still unconfirmed US Executive Director to the IMF displays the administration's signature hostility to multilateral institutions, and the recent appointment of David Malpass, an American, to lead the World Bank is another tip on the side of continuity with leadership selection practices. Now, the Trump appointee to the Bretton Woods institutions, however, may bring about an important discontinuity at the Bretton Woods institutions, which is reduced US engagement with and reduced US influence at these institutions, something that's in fact already begun. And it's very difficult, living on the side of the Atlantic that I live on, to find anything positive in the Trump administration, but I think the reduced US engagement with the Bretton Woods institutions may end up being one of the silver linings of the Trump administration. But I'll just note that even before the Trump appointees came on the scene, there were some notable discontinuities emerging, especially at the IMF. In terms of discontinuities during the global crisis, I'll flag a couple of them. IMF leadership, researchers, and staff working with crisis countries normalized the use of capital controls as a legitimate policy tool during the crisis. It is also the case that developing countries twice took the unprecedented step of lending to the IMF rather than borrowing from the IMF. This was in 2009 and again in 2012. The institution's client base also shifted from the developing world to the European periphery during the crisis. And there was also important evidence of tension between the IMF and Eurozone authorities on matters concerning debt sustainability in Greece, the decision to grant exceptional access in some of the larger Eurozone loan packages, on the most severe forms of austerity in some of the crisis countries, and on the channels and I should say also in terms of maintaining the link between the euro in some of the peripheral countries. There was conflict between the IMF and the Eurozone authorities on that matter as well. In addition, the crisis also opened up several channels for countries, particularly China, to increase its informal influence at the IMF. The crisis seems to have ushered in a new norm at the IMF, which involves giving key positions, including a deputy managing director position, to an official from the People's Bank of China. That's happened on 4 occasions since the crisis. We also find evidence of increasing inconsistency between the rhetoric from the IMF, its research, and its practice with individual countries. And in the book, I call these gaps between IMF rhetoric, research, and practice ambiguities. And I explore several ambiguities at the IMF in the book. And just an example of one ambiguity that I explore concerns the IMF rhetoric and research on inequality, which has become somewhat more progressive during the global crisis, while actual programs in countries like Greece have aggravated inequality. Now, the gap between rhetoric, research, and practice reflects, I think, not just public relations and what Catherine Weaver calls organized hypocrisy at the institution, though certainly that's a part of the story, but I think it reflects something else as well, and that is increasing contestation and confusion within the IMF. And I think it's in that context of confusion and contestation that we tend to see the emergence of ambiguity, something that Andy and I were talking about a bit over lunch. Now, productive incoherence is also evidenced in other areas of financial governance. One other area that I explore is in terms of the global financial architecture in the global South and the global East. Now, for institutions based in the global South and East, whose existence predates the global crisis, what we find is an expansion in the scale of activity, the geographic reach, and the introduction of novel mechanisms. And these changes are really apparent in institutions that provide financial support to countries during crises, so-called countercyclical support, and also in development banks that provide long-term finance to countries. And examples of older institutions in the developing world that have expanded their capacities and have introduced new mechanisms during the crisis include the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization of the ASEAN +3 countries, the Latin American Reserve Fund, and the Arab Monetary Fund. The Development Bank of Latin America is an example of a development bank that expanded its capacity during the crisis. What we also find when we look at Southern and Eastern institutions is what I call a hybridization of missions. And what I mean by hybridization is the decision taken by several regional and national banks to take on counter-cyclical roles. So you have development banks that are coming to play counter-cyclical roles during the global crisis. And examples of institutions that took on this kind of hybrid role are found in Brazil's National Bank of Economic and Social Development, the China Development Bank, the China Export-Import Bank, the Development Bank of Latin America, and the Islamic Development Bank. We also, of course, find developing country institutions that have been created during the global crisis. Some of the institutions that have been created during the global crisis focus on the provision of counter-cyclical support, some focus on the provision of development finance, and some provide both forms of finance. And examples of institutional creation include the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development, which is an initiative of the Eurasian Economic Community, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement of the BRICS, the New Development Bank of the BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that's led by China, and the 13 other funds that China has created to support the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, many of these institutions have interestingly signed cooperation agreements with one another, and I think what's something that's really notable is that in contrast to its opposition to the Asian Monetary Fund proposal in 1997, the IMF has been encouraging the expansion of and the connection among these institutions. The story of the Asian Monetary Fund proposal of 1997 is that the IMF, working with the US government and the Chinese government, very quickly killed the Asian Monetary Fund proposal, and the IMF discussions about rules of engagement among these institutions, and is developing an instrument to provide backstop finance to some of them in the event of crises. And I think in all of this, we're really experiencing productive incoherence in the expansion of disparate and often overlapping institutions that complement rather than displace the Bretton Woods institutions. Now, a final dimension of productive incoherence that I want to mention in terms of another of my empirical cases concerns the matter of capital controls, which I mentioned only in passing previously. Capital controls, of course, fell out of favor in the 1970s and remained so during the long neoliberal era. Credit rating agencies downgraded countries that dared to buck the trend to use capital controls during the long neoliberal era. And in fact, in the 1990s, following the East Asian financial crisis, we began to see uneven and tentative changes around ideas and practices around capital control. So this begins in the late 1990s, but importantly, these changes deepen and become much more consistent and important during the global crisis. During the global crisis, a wide range of developing countries use capital controls of various sorts to slow the tide of capital inflows when the US, Eurozone, and England offered few attractive opportunities to global speculators, and so many developing countries use controls on capital inflows to protect themselves from the pressures induced by large inflows of capital. And this thinking, change in thinking and change in practice around capital controls is really quite dramatic. Capital controls have been effectively rebranded to use a term from marketing, as a legitimate policy tool, even by the credit rating agencies, by the deeply conservative heart of the economics profession, which has developed some very fancy and technically sophisticated models using the tools of welfare economics in the last few years to demonstrate the legitimacy of capital controls as a policy tool. Capital controls have also been re-legitimized at the IMF, which even prescribed them to some borrowing and non-borrowing countries during the global crisis. And so stepping away from the empirics that I've sketched, what I'd like to say is that the institutional aperture and the innovations that I've examined in the book may not convince those of you that are really committed to heroic narratives of systemic change. I think that's unfortunate because from my perspective, recent crises might be best understood as crucial turning points in a contested, uneven, long-term process of pragmatic adjustment in financial governance. Now, I think a non-coherent system is one that's better apt to protect space for the diversity and experimentation that's necessary to support social learning and autonomy promoting development. And I think after decades of neoliberal coherence, the space that's provided by incoherence is really a welcome deviation. And I realize that it might seem strange for an economist to celebrate incoherence, since we're generally trained to value coherence and parsimony in theory, in policy, and in institutional design. And I think it's also not unreasonable at the present moment to really question how incoherence in the global financial architecture, or in any other arena for that matter, could be seen as beneficial when, of course, every day brings new kinds of neck-snapping incoherence from the White House or from this side of the Atlantic as well. But in my view, one advantage of incoherence and pluripolarity is that it provides developing countries with a degree of insulation from the global spillover effects of a noxious policy environment. And so an unintended consequence of a streamlined, coherent, centralized financial architecture is that structural weaknesses are magnified and that negative spillovers can be more powerfully and directly transmitted across countries and across regions. Now, I think incoherence presents other opportunities as well. A more densely populated institutional landscape expands opportunities for problem solving, for experimentation, for learning by doing and learning from others. It creates opportunities for new partnerships, networks, and coalitions. It presents opportunities for forum shopping that can be of particular benefit, especially to smaller countries. I think emergent productive redundancy, that is where you have duplicative institutions, increases the availability of long-term loans and resources that support crisis support, and generally that can fill gaps in the global financial architecture. And this can really reduce opportunities to contain or crises, and could provide opportunities to ameliorate crises, particularly if the rules of engagement among cooperating institutions are negotiated in advance of a crisis context. And I think finally the emergence of competitive pluralism is complicating the terrain on which the Bretton Woods institutions operate. And there's some evidence that actors at the Bretton Woods institutions are feeling the pressure that's coming from competitive pluralism, and that is pushing some of the changes and ambiguities that are emerging at these institutions. And so those are some of the upsides of incoherence in my view, and obviously I argue that the upside is substantial. But we also have to recognize that incoherence, redundancy, and pluripolarity do entail important risks. And indeed, I turn to the matter of risks of what we might think of as destructive aspects of incoherence in the concluding chapter of the book. One risk of incoherence is the innocent but damaging spillovers that can be associated with decisions by policymakers in one country to experiment and pragmatically adjust to challenges and risks. And this may come about, for example, when one country uses capital controls to stem a speculative bubble that can cause innocent but damaging spillovers onto other countries because it causes capital to move elsewhere, thereby exacerbating risk. Another example of an innocent but damaging spillover effect are the spillover effects associated with quantitative easing on developing countries during the global crisis. Another risk of incoherence may be associated with explicit beggar-thy-neighbor policies in which one country engages in innovations that are designed to or are likely to monopolize benefits while offloading risks and harms onto others. However, I think it's naive to think that beggar-thy-neighbor effects are associated only with incoherent regimes. Coherent regimes, such as neoliberalism, or going back further in historical terms, gold standard regimes, which were certainly also marked by coherence, involved exorbitant privilege by powerful actors and displaced the burdens of adjustment onto weaker actors. Now that said, I don't want to be seen as dodging the nationalist risks associated with the weakening of the authority of the institutions at the center of global financial governance. In my view, managing this problem and the problem of innocent spillovers ought to be among the principal responsibilities of the Bretton Woods institutions in a world of enhanced policy autonomy. Now, given the complexity of the problems at the present time, the Bretton Woods institutions will need to cultivate allies among the new institutions and networks of financial governance, especially among and with developing countries. Now, a final risk of incoherence that I want to flag at this time is the risk of systemic risk. Systemic risk may stem from the disconnected decisions of private and public actors. Uncertainties about where crisis response lies during a crisis, conflict around rules of engagement, conflict around leadership can certainly deepen instability during a crisis, as the Eurozone situation, I think, underscores quite clearly. Uncertainties and conflicts can also induce blame shifting precisely when cooperation is most needed. And I think it's this recognition that drives the IMF's recent engagement with the institutions in the global South and East. Now, none of the risks that I've mentioned are unique to the emerging Hirschmanian world, and neither are they resolved by it. Obviously, a multiplicity of risks emanate from both sides of the Atlantic and from the Pacific at the present time. Particularly worrisome are the high levels of corporate debt that's denominated in hard currencies in many developing countries. The slowdown in and the conflict with China is also, of course, a very important risk. There are risks obviously associated with Brexit, with Trump, and with the strengthening of nationalist parties in Europe. And in that context, it's not unreasonable to imagine a deglobalized world of increased autonomy marked by the proliferation of nationalist initiatives that generate economic and political rivalry, contagious instability, and that challenge the legitimacy and that threaten the effectiveness of the Bretton Woods institutions precisely when post-war traditions of multilateralism are under threat. But notwithstanding, I think, recognition of these risks, it's naive, I think, to think that we should be nostalgic for the coherence of the neoliberal era and for the monolithic governance architecture that underpinned the neoliberal era. After all, I think we can agree that it would not be better for developing countries if the Trump administration had at its disposal a kind of streamlined Bretton Woods architecture through which it could leverage its power to constrain policy autonomy, to frustrate progress on the SDGs, and otherwise wreak havoc and play out petty grudges. And so as damaging as Trump's impact has been so far, and certainly we may not have seen the worst yet, I think it's at least arguable that Trump lacks the levers under the evolving global financial architecture to impose his vision fully on others, at least with the same degree of success that was enjoyed by the champions of neoliberalism. So a Trump in, say, the late 1990s, at the height of neoliberalism's coherence, would arguably have posed a much deeper threat to developing countries. And I think it's implausible as well to think that the aspirations of developing countries would be better served by a return to the institutionally sparse, the coherent, and the centripetal financial and intellectual architecture of the last many decades. And so I think it's best really to think of the present period as an interregnum, as an era that's dominated by a dysfunctional Bretton Woods architecture and something else, the parameters of which are as yet unknown and unknowable and fundamentally uncertain. The evolving landscape, I think, is not likely to meld into something that represents a kind of new, coherent global financial architecture that resembles the orderliness of the pre-global crisis world. Partly that's because the array of China-led institutions is complementing, complicating, and radically reshaping the Bretton Woods landscape, where the line between advanced economy lending and developing country borrowing used to be clearly drawn and is no longer clearly drawn. The vacuum that's been created by the US's rejection of multilateralism suggests that there'll be greater space and more urgent need for China and others to step into the void that has been created. And of course, China stepping into this void presents opportunities, and we have to be honest, also presents real risks for developing countries. It also presents both opportunities and risks for US power and relevance, and for the shape of multilateralism going forward. And just to move to my conclusion, the emerging productive redundancy that we are seeing threatens the streamlined, top-down coherence of the Bretton Woods world, which promised efficiency, but in fact generated and socialized extraordinary risks, created vulnerabilities to contagious crises, and which deeply underserved developing countries. The redundancies and the networks of cooperation among developing country institutions and between them and the IMF may ultimately increase financial resilience by increasing the size and the range of crisis support opportunities while providing new avenues for the securing of long-term finance for development. When we think about the world of engineering in the kind of scientific sense, we know that engineers naturally understood the need for redundancy when they designed safety systems in order to ensure that systems do well when placed under intense stress. And I think the increasingly dense and networked global financial architecture is prudent in the very same way, even if it's by no means adequate in its current form to maintain stability during the next financial crisis, the timing of which is fundamentally uncertain, though its eventuality is not uncertain. And nothing that I've said today should be interpreted to suggest that I think, going back to the title of the book, that things won't fall apart. Indeed, they can and always will. But when they do, the question is, will a messier, pluripolar global financial architecture be better situated to respond to developing countries in a world in which the Trump administration and other nationalist governments are unlikely to have an appetite to allow the Bretton Woods institutions to perform their traditional roles? And certainly, I think the risks that we're seeing at the present moment suggest that we may know the answer to that question sooner rather than later. And I'll close my remarks there. Thank you.